Binding is usually divided into two categories: bias binding or straight of grain or cross grain binding. Bias binding is cut on the bias and it stretches. Well, here's the bias on the fabric. You see it stretches. As opposed to cross grain or straight of grain, which is cut on the selvage area or the cross grain, and there's very little give here. Most of package binding is cut on the bias. You can buy it in different widths and in a single fold or double fold. If you have a quilt with a curved edge, you need to use bias binding. It needs to stretch to get around those curves. Also, if you've got a quilt that is going to receive a lot of wear and washings, you'll probably want to use bias binding as it holds up better than straight of grain. Wall hangings or quilts that don't get used often don't need bias binding. It's okay to use the straight of grain binding, which I actually think is easier to make. In this video series, I'll show you how to make a type of binding called double fold or straight of grain or cross grain binding. I like to make my binding because I can make it any size, or I can use any fabric. Sometimes I use the fabric from the border so you don't notice the binding so much. Other times I like to try something different that might add another border or design element to the quilt. In the next video, I'll show you how to prepare your quilt for binding.